Good afternoon. My name is Adviti Naik, and I'm a postdoc at the Qatar Biomedical Research Institute. And it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to our talk today in the seminar series for early career researchers. As always, this webinar focuses on inspiring young researchers to actively pursue personal and professional development towards a fruitful career. If you missed any of our previous webinars, you can watch the recording on the HVKU YouTube channel. A couple of housekeeping rules before we begin. The microphone of all attendees has been muted, but we encourage you to post all of your questions on the Q&A tab and not the chat tab. If you're using a mobile device, you will find the Q&A tab by clicking on a circle with the 3 dots as shown here. Also, please direct these questions to all the panelists to make sure that your questions are visible to us. The webinar will be recorded and a link to it will also be shared with you in the next couple of days. Today, we have a very exciting topic up for discussion on pursuing careers in the biotech industry. If anyone at all in 2020 has shattered through their revenue and profit expectations, it's the biotech industry, one that is worth multi-billion dollars in the US and Europe alone. And with several countries now putting the spotlight on precision medicine, it's definitely a good time to think about biotechs. In our talk today, we hope to give you an insight into this industry as a prospective career opportunity for young scientists. With this, I would like to welcome our guest speaker for today, Dr. Stanton. Dr. Lawrence joined QBRI in 2019 and now is the director of the Neurological Disorders Research Center. His lab at QBRI generates induced pluripotent stem cells, or iPSCs, from patients with neurodegenerative and neurodevelopmental disorders, with the aim to direct the growth, differentiation, and reprogramming of these cells into clinically relevant tissues and models of human diseases. Previously, Dr. Lawrence served as Executive Director of Cell and Molecular Biology Research at Humacyte Incorporated, where he led a tissue engineering group developing transplantable human blood vessels. From 2002 to 16, he also held the position of principal scientist and served as deputy director at the renowned Genome Institute of Singapore. Prior to relocating to Singapore, he spent about 14 years at several biotech companies in the San Francisco Bay Area. Dr. Lawrence is also a founding member of the Stem Cell Society of Singapore and served as its president in 2016. Dr. Lawrence, we are very excited to host you today and hear about your extensive experience in the biotech industry. I'll hand over to you now for your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Adviti. It's really a pleasure to be invited to give some of my perspectives and career development, pertaining to the biotech industry. And as Adviti nicely outlined in our introduction, my experience has been one predominantly in the biotech industry. And so, risk of repeating some of what Adviti said, let me just introduce myself a little bit. So I'm an American citizen. I reside in California when I'm not living here in Qatar. So I did my PhD in biochemistry at State University of New York, and I worked on activation of oncogenes through chromosomal translocations. So even though I started my PhD work looking at genetic recombination that produces antibody diversity, as often with science, I found we stumbled into some heretofore unrealized process of chromosomal translocations that activate the c-Myc oncogene. So in my PhD work, I shifted from looking at immunoglobulin gene rearrangement into working on cancer biology. And then I decided to do a postdoc in cancer biology. And I was fortunate to go to the lab of Dr. J. Michael Bishop at University of California, San Francisco, where I continued to work on understanding how the Myc oncogenes influence tumorigenesis. So it was a very exciting time to be a postdoc in Dr. Bishop's lab. Actually, while I was in his lab was the year he won the Nobel Prize. So that was quite a treat to be part of the festivities for that. I didn't go to Sweden, but there was lots of parties and fun times. Even got to hold the physical Nobel Prize in my hand after he received it. So that was pretty exciting. So you can see from my background, I really trained traditionally, let's say in the academic sense. So I got a undergraduate degree in biology, went on to do PhD in biochemistry and postdoc in molecular cell biology. And so I was working, as you see, I did a postdoc in San Francisco. So this was one of the hotbeds of where biotech industry really originated. And so it was exciting times, and I'll tell you a little bit more about some of the history of biotech and some of the things that were happening at the time when I left my academic time. But let me just outline a little bit of some of the jobs I had, just to kind of give you some perspective, because obviously I'm not a career counselor. I'm going to give you a sense of what I learned through my path, but everybody takes their own path. Times are different than when I initiated on transitioning from academics to biotech than they are now. So, but I think I've done it for a long time, and I've been in lots of different companies in different countries. So I think I can give you some comparisons and contrasting views on what life is like. So you can see on this slide, let me turn my laser on here. You can see on this slide that a little bit of my CV. Starting after I finished my postdoc, I stayed in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, and I worked at these biotech companies. First one I worked at for almost 10 years was called Sios. So at that time, it was when recombinant DNA was really very new and being developed and applied to therapeutic discovery. So at the time, this was when people knew about proteins that had biological activities and potentially therapeutic activities. So the whole game at the time in the biotech industry was to clone genes and figure out how to express the proteins from those genes, produce them, put them into clinical trials for some hypothesized ability to be therapeutic, and then to get those approved and into the clinic. So that was the work that I did for 10 years, and I'll say a little bit more about that in the future here. Then I moved to a company that was quite different, and this is Agilent Technologies. And so, my work in Sios and even during my PhD and postdoc training, I was very much at the early cutting edge of when genomics was coming to bear. And so I was an early adopter of applying microarray technology to understand biology and pathobiology. And so I actually had an opportunity to spend a couple of years working at a company that was really about creating the tools that both academics and companies can work at. So a very different environment to go from a biotech company trying to make therapeutic proteins to a company that was sort of producing the tools and technology that can be harvested and applied to drug discovery and basic science. So after 2 years at Agilent, I moved to a company called Geron. So this was a big change for me in the sense that it was going back to doing biology, but this company was really at the forefront of working on using human embryonic stem cells as cell-based therapies. And the reason they hired me is because they needed somebody to do genomics on these newly isolated stem cells. So this is back in around 2000 when human ES cells were first isolated and expanded by Jamie Thompson. And in fact, Geron had funded the work by Jamie Thompson, and because of that funding, had patent rights to commercialize the applications coming from human embryonic stem cells. So we were deep sequencing into ES cells, trying to understand what made an ES cell an ES cell, and trying to use that information to control our ability to direct differentiation of these ES cells into therapeutically useful cell types. And so it was a very exciting time, and as often is the case, it kind of created a pivot point for me in my career, because I had been sort of a technologist, working on cancer, diabetes, and obesity at Sios, and then tools at Agilent, and then working on embryonic stem cells at Geron, sort of genomics on ES cells. And that gave me the opportunity to take a very exciting position at the Genome Institute in Singapore, where basically I was hired because I was doing genomics on stem cells, and it was a Genome Institute, and they were very much interested in taking advantage of the hot new field of human embryonic stem cells. And so you can see that was the longest tenure I had of any part of my career, was 14 years at the Genome Institute in Singapore. At the end of that stay, I went back to the US and actually was hoping to go back to the San Francisco Bay Area, which is my home, but there was a very exciting job opportunity that I became aware of in North Carolina, and that's a company called Humacyte. And Humacyte uses cells to manufacture blood vessels, so fully human blood vessels. So it was really quite exciting, and I'll say a little bit more about that. And then in 2019, I came to QBRI. So like GIS, the GIS was a government-funded translational research institute. So not a biotech company, not an academic center, but somewhere in between, which, very different sort of drivers and expectations in an organization like that. And QBRI is, as those who are here in Qatar, certainly my mates here at QBRI know that we're, this sort of hybrid model. We're using government funding to try and come up with opportunities to exploit understand therapeutic opportunities, particularly in neuro, diabetes, cancer, and soon infectious diseases. So that's a little bit about my background, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what life is like in biotech and what is biotech, and what kind of skill sets you need. But I think it's worth taking a moment just to reflect on biotech. The industry has evolved, of course. And in fact, it's really kind of evolved out of pharmaceutical industry. And I'll have a slide in a minute comparing pharmaceutical industry versus biotech industry. But if you think about, the whole idea of developing therapeutics, really, it goes back thousands of years. But I think from the industrial standpoint, it was really around the 1900s, 1800s to early 1900s that we started seeing companies really working on scaled up production of therapeutics. And the classic one that people generally know about is aspirin, which basically came out of a pharmacy. Then they made a company out of it because so many people were using aspirin because it's so effective that we needed to scale up procedures to make it. It's a small molecule. So this is chemistry. These early pharmaceutical companies were really based on making small molecules. But over time, these companies started, moving into more, well, I'm going to call it biologics. And you can think, everybody knows about Fleming discovering, from penicillin from a mold, so they weren't synthesizing it, but they were extracting it from natural sources. Similarly with insulin in the 30s, you couldn't make insulin, but, you can go to the slaughterhouse and get, bovine or ovine pancreas and extract enough insulin to treat diabetics. So the industry was growing. It's still predominantly around chemistry of small molecules, but beginning to branch into biologics that could be purified. So I'll say more about pharmaceutical versus biotech in a minute, but this is really the transition, I would say, from what I call the biotechnology industry, which was when the idea that you could make human proteins as therapeutics. Now, obviously, people were using human proteins as therapeutics before, but they weren't manufacturing them until we were able to, apply recombinant DNA technology. And for many of you, this happened before you were born. But I was basically finishing high school and moving on to my undergraduate when this was a very huge breakthrough that you could recombine DNA from bacteria and humans are all the same chemically, and so now you could take the human DNA, put it into bacteria, and start making insulin, making proteins. And indeed, that was the major breakthrough with recombinant DNA. Is now you had the opportunity to make therapeutically useful proteins. So Genentech was one of the first to produce a fully human recombinant protein, human insulin. That was in 1982. I just give you another example. Cetus Corporation cloned and expressed interferon in 1986. This was a big breakthrough at the time. People thought this was going to cure cancer. So you can see that these rapid advances in technology quickly get adapted and then move into industry. And so this was really the big distinction at the time, that pharmaceutical companies weren't interested in recombinant proteins. They were still kind of, working with small molecules. And the biotech industry really, was kind of pushing on how to use recombinant technology to clone, express, and manufacture therapeutically useful proteins. And then there's many other examples, but I just want to also add on recombinant antibodies because this has become a huge industry in itself. Companies are very active in coming up with antibodies as very useful in a wide range of therapeutics. So again, the technological breakthrough started when Milstein and Kohler were able to make a hybridoma. Mouse antibodies could be produced in large scale. A single clone could make large amounts of the protein, and you could select for the clone of choice so that the antibodies being generated were going to be targeted a particular antigen of interest. And so, quickly people started to figure out how to make antibodies as therapies. The first one in 1986 was for resisting transplantation rejection, so antibody targeting one of the cell surface molecules. At first, they were all fully mouse, and this created problems for rejection because the human body recognizes as foreign. So then a lot of work went into both making chimeric antibodies that would be tolerated by the human, and then fully human antibodies. And again, all this is revolves around the ability to do genetic engineering to create these fully humanized antibodies and to produce them in large quantities, manufacture them in the lab under highly stringent good manufacturing processes so that they would be safe and hopefully efficacious when they got into the patient. So I've kind of made a distinction between biotech and pharma, and indeed there's a distinction. Maybe it's blurring a bit over time, but if you think about the big pharmas, as I call them, pharmas, I mean, they're huge companies. I mean, Johnson & Johnson, probably the largest based on revenue, $56 billion annually of revenue. That's a lot of money. And you can see these other big players, which I'm sure you've all heard of. They have billions in revenue per year, and they have 100,000 or more employees. So these are gigantic companies. Typically, biotech companies, even ones that are, successful are much smaller. So Amgen's an exception. I mean, it's got 23 billion in revenue, but it only employs 20,000 employees compared to these that have 100,000. But you can see, some of the other, major biotech companies around that you've probably heard of, their revenues are really in the tens of millions and not the tens of billions, and tenfold smaller in size. So biotech companies tend to be smaller. They get engulfed and taken over by big companies. So Genentech was purchased by Roche many years ago. Some of these other early biotech companies were also bought. So that's why I said, again, there's some blurring. So it's not that pharma only sticks to small molecules anymore. They're really getting into the biologics as well. But a lot of the discovery of biologics comes from these what I call biotech companies. These are sort of the big ones that are successful, but there's literally thousands of startup biotech companies. There's not really thousands of startup pharma companies. These are all big, huge mega corporations, whereas biotech companies can range from really literally 5 or 6 people working sort of in a basement lab to companies on the scale of Amgen, which has 20,000 employees. So again, the size of the company is different. A little bit of how they operate is different. There tends to be a lot more early stage biotech companies working on early discovery, so you'll have more research. But as these companies get bigger, they also have to get into more development and manufacturing and clinical trials, which I'll talk about in a minute. So that's certainly a distinction, not black and white. But then one other type of operation that I mentioned, because there's obviously career opportunities in any of all of these, and just because you move into one doesn't mean you can't go into the other. And I mentioned that I worked at Agilent, which is what I call a tool company. So there's lots of companies out there that are making technology or services or capabilities that these companies and of course academic labs can tap into. So we all know Thermo Fisher. They have 25 billion in revenue and big 75,000 employees. So we buy reagents, we buy small equipment, yada from these companies. So clearly there's need for scientists as employees and companies developing these tools to be used in drug discovery or in basic research. So let's talk a little bit, and I've kind of touched a bit on this, is the types of drugs, therapies that are out there. And, there's many, and this is really just meant to be a short list, but it covers a lot. And as I mentioned, there's small molecules. These are chemically synthesized. I mentioned aspirin, but Lipitor, this sells tens of billions per year. It's a lipid lowering drug. Small molecule, chemically synthesized. It's small, meaning that it's orally bioavailable. This is the big driver for pharma. They want to make a small pill that they can sell to millions, literally millions of people, that they can ingest and treat their conditions. That's in contrast to things like biologics, which, because of their size and because of their chemical composition, you can't swallow it. It just looks like a hamburger if you ate, a growth factor. You're going to digest it. So these all primarily become injectables, and people are working on how to formulate insulins and things to get across nasal barriers and be able to ingest it. But primarily biologics are larger, and because they're proteins, they get, digested, so they pretty much are administered by injection. And same with monoclonal antibodies. I mentioned that monoclonal antibodies are a huge drug type now. This is pretty new. Pharma in early days, they just shunned the idea of manufacturing something this large, because you think about insulin. It's 100 amino acids or so, where you compare an antibody, which is huge. And you think about this from a manufacturing standpoint and quality control. Many opportunities for things to go wrong, but the technology, when the need was there, people pushed forward to make it happen, to figure out how to produce these things, to make them work and to make them safe. A hot new topic now is cell and gene therapy. And so I won't say too much about that, but I think most of you heard about the sort of CAR T cells, where you can, basically take an individual who's got some sort of malignancy, a leukemia of some sort, and extract out their T cells, engineer them so that they now will fight the tumors, put those back in, so they're your own cells that have been engineered, and then they will last indefinitely in the body and continue to fight off any recurring new tumor cells that develop. So very exciting technology, but huge challenge from thinking about going from manufacturing kilogram amounts of aspirin and in the lab, compared to making large batches of chemically defined, safe, reproducible cells. These are $1 million per treatment, and you can buy an aspirin for a penny, right? So scale and manufacturing, so many differences. So if you're thinking about jobs, there's whole kinds of different needs. For industries that are working on chemistry versus making protein biologics, large or small, and now of course cell and gene therapies. And of course, we all are thinking a lot, given our life in COVID these days, about vaccines. And people have been working on vaccines for a long time. The big companies tend to stay away from vaccines. There's no money to be made in vaccines, and it's kind of a shame, that dollars drive the discoveries of these things. And if there's no money to be made, then people don't work on it, even though we need them for things like COVID and other emerging infectious diseases. So again, some new technologies are coming along. I think we've all heard of Moderna and Biotech, are using injected RNA to raise the antigen against COVID spike protein. So vaccines are again another type of therapeutic, and we shouldn't ignore the whole field of diagnostics. This is a big area, and it used to be that, you wanted to do a diagnostic just to determine, if somebody had a disease or an infection. But now as people work on therapeutics, they want to have what we call a companion diagnostic. And so you want to, if we think about precision medicine, you need to do a really detailed diagnosis to say this patient should get this drug versus that drug, maybe at this dose versus that dose. And so companion diagnostics or standalone diagnostics is a huge area. So, with that being said, that means there's different companies with different expertise, but, they all need scientists and well-trained people to work on many aspects of, both initially discovering these things, or if you want to buy it from another company or buy a company, you need somebody to do the diligence to say this is worth buying. You need people to develop them. You need people to take them into the clinic. We need people to manage the regulatory process of trying to get these drugs approved, and then ultimately into the marketing. So that's why these pharma companies are gigantic, because they fully integrated pharmaceutical company has from soup to nuts all these different components to bring a drug to safely to the market and sell it. So let's now talk a little bit, kind of the topic of this seminar series is jobs. How do we, prepare ourselves? What should we look for in these jobs? What's the right job for me? And, obviously there's no single answer. I'm not a career counselor. I'm trying to give you more of a sense for what's out there, because I think many of us, we train in sort of the academic world, and we don't even know until you actually get out there into working at these companies that there are just hundreds of types of jobs and thousands of actual jobs that you might not have thought about. And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit about these types of jobs. And so I think we tend to think about research, so certainly biotech and pharma, they need people doing research. They need people to, come up with the new ideas, that they can translate, so thinking about the problem of the patient, what's the patient's need, and then, what can we do to intervene there. So obviously there's a lot of research, but in actual fact, a lot of these companies, the research was done outside, and the company then launches, from some discovery out of an academic place, and then figures out how to take that on to make it therapeutically useful. So although there's certainly research jobs, and a research job in biotech and is probably not that different from a research job in academics. I mean, you're going to be needing more or less the same skill sets. The drivers of what to work on will certainly be different. Companies aren't interested in publishing; they're interested in figuring out how this thing works and how it can be applied. But there's definitely research jobs. So I think you guys mostly would know, what the life of a researcher is like. But probably these other ones, maybe, most of you have not had so much experience in what it's like in the life of a biotech company to work in development or manufacturing or clinical reg or management or even sales and marketing. Let's take a few minutes to talk about development. So we often hear R&D, research and development. But I can tell you that mostly what goes on in companies, is more D than R. I mean, like I said, the R usually comes from some discovery elsewhere. If there's a patent, you license it, you bring it in, but you really got to get it to work. And that becomes development. So this is still science. This is still creative science. You really have to, figure out, what's the problem, how to solve the problem, how do you take something that was initial discovery and really, take it to the next step. And so it's a lot of hard work, and it's a lot of time, and there's a lot of, opportunities for failure in this during, you think about the drug development process. But there's tons of jobs out there for very good quality scientists, and this is not boring work. I mean, this is very creative science, and there's different stages of development. Sometimes, you have, the research people came up with the initial finding and say, okay, this looks good. Can we make this consistently? And so then you have to develop a process that maybe was working at the bench scale, but then you want to scale it up. So there's people who think about this stuff, how to go from a small batch to a large batch to, gigantic biofermenters. So huge numbers of jobs in what I call process development and other aspects of development. And then you need people who are very skilled in running analytical methods, because if you're making something, you want to know that what you made is the same thing every time. Small molecules, you run HPLC, you look to make sure that 99.99% of it is aspirin and not some byproduct. But when you start getting into proteins and antibodies, you really need even more sophisticated analytical tools, and to be able to evaluate that these proteins are primarily what you expect, and that's the way you can ensure safety and efficacy. So tons of jobs in this sort of sector, what I just call analytical methods. And again, these are scientific jobs. I mean, you don't necessarily have to have a PhD to run some of these analytical methods, but you definitely have to have sound scientific knowledge and technical expertise. And I'll talk a little bit more about. Maybe I'll say that now. Is that when you do things for making drugs that are going to go into people, you have to be very careful on how you do it. And there's a lot of record keeping, and there's a lot of metrics that are established. And so people with analytical skills and attention to detail, and concerned about reproducibility, these are the good traits that go into any scientist, but are particularly imperative for people that are working on taking something off of the research bench onto further onto the process of. So let's talk a bit about manufacturing. So, once you have established a process, and you have a drug and you want to actually start putting it into people, so you have to be able to manufacture it. Even in clinical trials, before it's approved for commercial for sale, you have to make enough of it to test it in people. And if you're going to test it in people, it better be clean, it better be safe, and then you're joining the trial to find out if it's works or not. So there's tons and tons of jobs in manufacturing. I'll say primarily manufacturing work is done with people without advanced degrees, but typically a bachelor degree. I would say that in R&D, it's a combination of bachelor degree people as well as PhD level people. Manufacturing tends to be a little bit more, follow the SOP, the standard operating procedure. So you have to be attentive to detail. You have to be careful. You have to be reliable. So again, lots of jobs. This is something that people that haven't gone on for an advanced degree might and still interested in science and have scientific skills, which I'll talk about in the next slide or two. They're quite good at being able to do this, and there's tons of jobs, whether you're manufacturing small molecules or small proteins or large proteins or onto cell and gene therapy. Another area which I've known a lot of colleagues who went down this direction, what I call clinical and regulatory. So if you want a drug to go to market, then you have to do clinical trials. And to do clinical trials is not only to get it to the doctors to put it into the patients and evaluate that it works, but you also have to keep very careful notes and records on this. And so the last company I worked at Humacyte, I ran the research team, and it was about 7 people. The company was about 100 people. I would say that about 50 of the people were in clinical and regulatory because we were running clinical trials. We had to document everything. If you put a submission to the FDA in the US, Food and Drug Administration or other regulatory agencies, you have tons and tons of documents that need to be done. And so, it's not an R&D job, but I tell you, people who have scientific backgrounds, tend to be quite good at this. Again, you won't need an advanced degree to get into this. And the other thing that a lot of, I remember, speaking to a number of colleagues, that there's a good career path in this. I mean, obviously you have to get in at the entry level, but you can work your way up to managing groups of people and even becoming senior managers and VPs, without an advanced degree, because you've done your time and you understand the process and you know how to work the system. So then, of course, the last two things, are pretty much true of any industry. You don't necessarily need a scientific background, but if you want to manage science, then it's good to be able to speak the terms of science, understand your processes. So, scientists, often advance up through the ranks and start managing, either divisions or full departments or whatever. So that's more of a career track. Obviously you need to have some sense of business, but certainly the science background helps. A lot of people with science backgrounds end up going in and doing sales and marketing, of scientific, whether it's a therapeutic or a tool. So there's, definitely jobs, out there for people who sort of, let's say they're tired of working at the bench. They kind of want to get out there and travel and meet other people, and they just want a different pace of life, which certainly sales and marketing can bring. So I've kind of touched a little bit on this, but what is it about a scientist that makes them good? If you want to get a job, you got to be good at something, and be able to sell yourself, And so I always think about two things: your technical competence and your domain knowledge, And then of course there's other aspects I think that are good for any and all fields. But thinking scientifically, you have to be technically competent in something. And usually I would even stress that it's good to be technically competent in a couple areas, so, you could be a good gene jockey, how to clone, how to use, genomics tools, arrays or whatever. But you also may know some cell biology, so you have to have those technical skills, and you have to have demonstrated proficiency. Just because you went to and took a hands-on course at university, no one's going to really buy that, you have technical competence in that. I mean, you have to establish this, and you have to be able to demonstrate that you are good technically. And these other issues, really matter. And I think a lot of us in science, we go into science partly because we have these sort of um, characteristics, but they also get honed over time as we work in these fields. And I bring this up partly because a lot of what we learn in science is actually quite applicable to working in other industries, and I say that because some people find that science isn't where they want to take the long-term career, and they might move somewhere else. And so I would say if you've had some background in science and you're making a jump to some other field, play up to your interviewers that, you're a scientist, you're very careful, you're very organized, that, you're thoughtful. I mean, these are important skills. I mean, if more people in the world, would pay attention to detail and be organized, we'd all be in a better place, even if we weren't working directly on science. You have a critical mind, you think of alternatives. I mean, these skills are usually like I said, inherent in people who go into science, but also then get further developed. And so take advantage of them, but also pay attention to make sure you are continuing to develop those capabilities. Domain knowledge, I think it's pretty obvious, but I say this because, you need to have a strong suit. If you are looking for a job, you need to be able to sell yourself. And, so maybe you sell yourself as, I'm an expert in doing sequencing, so you might have a technological strength, but there's some people who, have really, I'm thinking, like maybe PhD postdoc, people who spend a lot of time thinking about diabetes, for instance, or motor neuron degeneration. I mean, they have a domain knowledge, in something other than what technical skills they have. They have knowledge, and this is important, and it could just be about fundamental biology of the pancreas, or it could be somebody who thinks about diseases, or you're just good at, thinking about how, proteins are folded and expressed, and this is important too. So, hone, develop, some, again, primary and perhaps secondary expertise, and play that up when you write your CV and when you go out on your job interview, and continue to stay on top of that field. You need to be well versed and knowledgeable on that, be able to talk to anybody in the field. So, follow the literature, attend conferences. Now that so many conferences are available online, you should really be going to more and more conferences to get exposed to what's going on in the field. And that's this last point. You want to know where your field is, and a lot of knowing where the field is to know what the field is missing and where the field is trying to go. And you often pick that up when you read the literature and go to conferences. And then creativity. It's somewhat either we are or we aren't, but I think there's the opportunity to develop that in yourself, and again, I think this should be a strong point of any scientist. We do it all the time. When our experiments don't work, what happened? I can't figure this out. You get together with people, you problem solve, you troubleshoot, and also designing next experiments. So, I think this is, again, a important skill to have and not to underestimate, and again, use it as a selling point for yourself. Have examples of where you've been creative. And then I can't emphasize this last point. I put it last, but it's definitely maybe even the most important. Sometimes scientists are geeks, and sometimes we go into science because we're not good people. Don't have the good people skills. But I tell you, especially if you want to go into industry, there's a lot more interaction. There's a lot more team-oriented type projects. You have to have good people skills. You have to be able to work together. You have to be able to articulate, what you're working on. If you're more senior, you're going to have to make strong cases about why you should pursue X versus Y, and why you want to do pathway A versus B. So you have to be able to communicate, verbally and in writing. Very important, And I'll be honest, the English is the language of science now, and so you have to have good ability to speak and write in English if you want to have a career, because these things have become so international. I'm not saying you only have to, but work on your English. It really will pay off for you big time. And then I just leave this last point here, which is networking. And this is part of people skills, build your relationships, always keep in touch with people, don't burn any bridges if you leave a company, even if it didn't work out, or academic place. So, go to places where you can meet new people, build a network. Very important. So I think this is my last slide, and this is, I get these kind of questions like, well, where should I go? And some people can't move. They have family obligations, their roots are deep or whatever, and this is tricky. But one thing that I suggest is, and this often happens where you have two people in the family looking for jobs, is to go to a hub. Go to one of these places where there's lots of jobs. Yeah, you can go to some place where that's the only company. But what happens when that company folds? They lay people off. Then you don't have another place to go. Whereas if you're working in the San Francisco area where I was, it's hard to read this, but there's a couple of thousand biotech companies there, and same in some of these other hubs. So there's an advantage if you get a job opportunity and you say, okay, maybe it's not the perfect job, but it's taking you to Boston. Get in there, get some experience, start networking, keep your eyes open. And then, maybe you'll find out that this company down the road is just, it's a startup company and you're looking for somebody just like you in an area that you're interested in. So I do consider, and this doesn't mean that there aren't important and opportunities elsewhere, but think about these hubs. And I just listed sort of the top 5, but there are definitely others, in other countries besides, I guess most of these are U.S. besides London. But anyway, here's a world map, and there's definitely jobs out there. But think about the hub, especially if you have husband and wife, they both want jobs, even if they're not both in biotech. You're in a city area, there's more jobs. If your job doesn't work out for whatever reason, it's nicer that you don't have to physically move. You can just keep your eyes open and find a job, that's still within commute. You saw my first 3 jobs, I never had to move, where I was living, and I worked in 3 different companies and just had a different commute. Again, this whole importance of networking, because if you're in a hub, then, you're finding people, you're running into people who work in a different industry or people you work with and they move and then you're connected to that company. Use your LinkedIn and keep networked. And for some people, startups is fun, and these are usually word of mouth. It's not like you just go into Biospace or any of these other job searching places and find all the jobs. Sometimes it's just just an early stage thing that who gets you in the door. So hopefully that gives you some food for thought. And I stop there and see. So BD can field some questions for me. Sorry, I ran a little longer than I expected, but hopefully we still have some time for Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence, for that insight into the biotech industry and also for all the career advice. So if I may start with a couple of questions before we move to the audience. So from your bio, you've been in so many different kinds of research settings. So what would you say are the key consideration factors that a young scientist must keep in mind while deciding whether to go into biotech or industry or pharma?
Yeah, there's no 1 or 2 key things. First of all, you need to understand what the job expectation is. And the other thing I'll say is that, no job is ever going to be perfect. You should look at every job and you just say, what are the pros and cons? Because sometimes you actually find out, wow, I hadn't thought about this. This is something I would be interested in. So I would say, keep your mind open to different opportunities. And the other thing is, it's not going to be the job you're going to take for 20 years. You saw my career. Sometimes the longest job I was at was for 14 years, and several of them there was for 2 years. I wouldn't waste your time and go someplace for 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 months. But if you can go a place for 2 years, and you sell some good things about it that you like, maybe some things that weren't ideal, it doesn't have to be forever. Because I think some people say, oh, this doesn't look like it's going to be a chance for advancement or whatever. They can talk themselves out of it because they don't see themselves being there for 20 years. But in this day and age, people don't, like in the old days, stay with one company forever. So keep your eyes open. I wouldn't just bin everything. Oh, I don't want to go to pharma, or I don't want to go to biotech. There's pros and cons of it. You got to look at the specific position. So you got to understand the position. You got to understand the company. Probably the most important part of any job is who your boss is. If you don't get along with your boss, your job is going to be miserable. So. You should be interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. I see too many people come in and they just sit there in the interview and you ask them questions, and they give you, I'm the interviewer, I ask them questions and they give me answers. they should be asking me questions. That tells me that they're engaged, but I don't want them to come if they don't think this is the right job. So, you really have to kick the tires as best you can. So maybe I'll just wrap there.
Great. So maybe related to this and something that you also touched upon in your presentation. So there's a lot of geographical bias on where these biotech hubs are located. And sometimes that happens to be one of the key factors in the decision to join academia versus industry, especially in the MENA region. I mean, most researchers are limited to academia because of the lack of big pharmas or biotechs here. So in your opinion, what are the prospects of establishing a vibrant biotech hub here in Qatar, and by when do you think this might be practically feasible?
I mean, I could give the sort of, politically correct answer, but let me tell you my story from Singapore, because, this is what Singapore wanted to do. So there's a couple of things you need to have a biotech industry. One is, you touched on it, you need the academic places. It didn't just happen in Boston. This didn't happen in San Francisco and other places. This is where hotbed academic communities are. So this is often where companies get spun out of, So you need this kind of, creative, academic landscape, Then you need, what I call the entrepreneurial spirit, So then you need people who are, gung-ho about, okay, we know what the clinical needs are. Here's something that this lab discovered. What can I take forward? And so when I worked in Singapore, I would say we had both of those. We had good, academic science going on. Lots of cool stuff coming out. We had smart people who wanted to, take these findings and move them. But then the other thing that you need, and maybe there's two other things, but one is you need money. You need investors. And so if you don't have investors, you're never going to get it off the ground. And so my frustration in Singapore is we had all these great ideas. We would sort of have them in initial stages, but the investors in Singapore, they wanted to buy real estate. If they didn't want to take a risk on a biotech company because, probably 90% of them fail, but the 10% that are successful are huge payoffs, But again, there was a risk adverse, culture of investment, Anyway, the point is you need those three things. Maybe the fourth thing that I didn't think about till just now is you need to have the clinical community. In other words, you have to have the patients, right? So, why would you develop a drug in Qatar when there's only, a couple million people to serve? Would you rather do that in the EU or in the US where you have, hundreds of millions of people, It doesn't mean you can't start that up, in a company, but you have to think about where your market is. You're going to do your clinical trials, you want to have patients and all that. So, so the world is becoming more connected and international. So, I would say that Qatar, the first step, and I think it's well along the way, which is to, build a competency in application, translational science, whatever terms you want to use. And, and certainly that's what QBRI is about, Sidra. I don't want to not name names because then I'll leave somebody out. But, I think there's a lot of that going on. There's good basic university science going on. There's, the research institutes, so for sure that has to happen. The next part of the ecosystem is to, really develop this kind of concept of translation. And I think the brain trust above knows that, and making that happen, but then you're going to need people to invest, and hopefully people like organizations like QF will do that. So anyway, you need all of those things, and it's hard to do, but it can be done.
Yes, for sure. And I think this is something maybe that the local graduates and researchers are also interested in, and hopefully it will provide opportunities in the future in the region in this case. Another question I had was, as opposed to big pharmas, when you work at startup biotechs, there's a lot of learning right from research to product development, like you mentioned. So do you recommend science graduates to undertake courses in terms of business management, or advertising or regulatory types of courses to flourish in such an environment? Or is it something that you pick up with time and experience in working in these settings?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. For sure, as you work in those companies, you will just be, by osmosis, taking in some aspects of business. So if you take business courses, I mean, they can be marketing, they can be, organizational structures. I think all of that is good. I mean, I've always encouraged scientists, in their undergraduate period, to take some business courses, economics, everything, because, it can help you run your household, help you manage your small lab or whatever. I think all of those skills are good. Probably, if you wanted to go into sort of, let's say, the business management of science, I've known lots of people have done that. So usually they start out, they get their undergraduate degree, maybe a PhD, and then they're working in the lab, and then they go on and get an MBA or a master or business degree. Then I know plenty of people have done that. It's not to mean you couldn't do it the other way, but there's a lot of people who are just pure business people, and they get hired by science, organizations, and they don't know anything about science, but they can learn enough science. But I think if you have already a science background, then you want to add on top of that some business capability. It's a very excellent way to go. I would suggest maybe getting started with some early stage job in science, and then going on and getting your advanced degree, your business degrees. But again, I think you can do it, lots of different ways. There's no one size fits all.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lawrence. Can we have the questions from the audience now, please? Thank you, Salam. So the first question is, as a second-year biotech student, I would like to know what would be your advice to start a stable, evolving career in biotech industry?
Experience. You got to get experience. So I'm not sure what second-year biotech is. I don't know if that's undergrad. So how do I say this? I interview a lot of people, I want to hire an RA in my lab, and they're fresh grads. I'm going to get 20 CVs to look at of fresh grads who majored in biology, and they took some courses in biochemistry, they ran some gels, or they did something, When I look at that, I'm not excited, It was like, you haven't stood out, to have, really demonstrated what I call that technical competency. Because frankly, the way courses, are done, these practical courses, you don't really do experiments. You're following a cookbook. You're making a cake, great. The cake tastes good at the end, but you didn't really do science, research, troubleshoot, yada, yada. Did a little bit of it. It doesn't mean you hadn't had anything. So I'm just going to answer the question the way I'm thinking about this, which is, you got to get, in your foot in the door. And, in this day and age, to do R&D type jobs, just a basic undergraduate degree is not enough. So if this biotech student means that they're getting like a master's or some kind of degree, another year or two, I think this is an excellent way to go. I think to get an R&D job now with just a Bachelor of Science is very hard. Doesn't mean you can't get it, but at least have done maybe some internships or something. Again, be able to write a CV that demonstrates that you actually spent a year or two at the bench working on something, and can articulate well that you can, follow directions, you can work on complex problems, you can balance, multiple, shifting priorities and all that stuff. So you got to kind of get out there and take that entry-level job, even if it looks kind of like grunt work. Get the experience, and then you can move up. Don't think you're going to start with a Bachelor of Science and then, be sitting in an office directing 5 people to do a project.
Maybe related to this, if I can ask, is it ever too late to switch to industry from academia? I mean, after having done a couple of postdocs and been in academia for so long, I see a lot of job ads from industry which says you need experience in industry. So how is it ever too late?
Well, there's many different paths. I would say that, typically it's hard if you go into industry to then want to go back into academics. It does happen. I actually sort of did that. I went right from my postdoc into biotech for 14 years, and then I went to Genome Institute of Singapore, which was more or less academic. So that doesn't mean it can't happen, but usually if you're on the academic path, you kind of stay on the academic path until you jump to industry. And then once you're in industry, it's typically hard to go back. But it's never too late to, if what you're asking me is it too late to go into industry? And I would say not, Again, I've managed people who've, had, 5 years postdoc experience and even, started a job, in an academic place. And they came in and they were, working at the bench, and directing one RA. And for some people, they might think that was beneath them, but, my first job after I've done a lot of postdoc was I was working at the bench and, had an RA working with me, and so in a way it was sort of like a senior postdoc. I mean, I already did 5 years of postdoc. Science takes a long time. Other careers are more fast paced, but, I think with science, you typically, especially if you're going down to PhD and then postdoc training, and then even that's only going to get you sort of an entry level R&D job. But, you can definitely move out earlier. Anyway, I think that's hopefully answered your question.
Yes, it did. Thank you. So the next question we have is it possible to balance between both academia and industry, or would you advise a postdoc to pick a line?
Trying to see what's behind the question here. I think the bottom line to this question is, what's a better life, academia or industry? I don't think there's a simple answer to that, because obviously it depends on the person. I mean, let's just weigh the pros and cons. So what's fun about academia? It's like you can really do, cutting edge stuff. I mean, if you're working in academic science, you're not repeating something that's already been done. You're not going to get published if you're just doing what somebody else did. So you're always looking for new and different things, and that's exciting. Because then you publish a paper, whatever. Whereas if you go in an industry, you're not going to publish. I mean, people don't publish their findings. They keep them as trade secrets. It's not that you don't get any publications, but that's not the driver. And a lot of stuff you work on turns out that it's not advancing as fast as they hope, and you pull the plug on it. So in academia, a postdoc will beat his head on the wall for 5 years and hopefully get a paper and then move on. Whereas in industry, if you're beating your head on the wall for 5 years, you're not going to have a job. After 1 or 2 years, they're going to say, kill that project, move on to something else. So with industry, you got to be willing to adjust and say, if I can't demonstrate quickly enough, then it's going to move on. And it's not necessarily for scientific reasons. Sometimes it's for business reasons. So there's pushes and pulls. The good side of industry is they have the money, right? So if they say, if we're doing this, they're going to give you enough money to do that project. And if you can't get it to work, doesn't mean you because you messed up. It just says that, okay, time is money, and we ran out of time, we ran out of money. But they'll give you the resources. In the academic world, you're a starving artist, in a lot of places. I mean, we'd all love to be in the lab where we have lots of money and can do whatever we want, living in the ivory tower. But let's face it, that's few and far between in the academic world, So, I jumped out of the academic world and industry, and then popped back into academia, back to industry, and now I'm more or less back in academia. I like industry. I'm just going to say it that way. It's not that I dislike academia. I mean, there's really some fun aspects of it. But chasing after grants, trying to get publication, I mean, I can't stand that stuff, to be honest with you. So I'd rather be working in a well-funded industry. Are there downsides to industry? Absolutely. I mean, industries will just decide we're not working on that, lay off, 1,000 people, and, you're looking for another job. That typically doesn't happen in academia, but if you're good and you got laid off, you go and find another job. I got laid off from Geron, and that's when I moved to Singapore, and that was the best move I ever made. So layoffs happen in industry, and they tend not to happen in academia, but there's lots of jobs in industry more than academia. So pluses and minuses. I don't necessarily think you have to pick, but let's face it, a lot of postdocs, would love to have an academic position, but there's just not that many of them. So I would not look at it as postdoc, I have to settle for a second best. I definitely don't think that's the case. So postdoc, I mean, moving into an industry job is definitely a very good career path for many, 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 many people. And more people will do it that way than to do a typical academic pathway.
Yeah.
Something else, Aviti?
Can we have the next question, please? Do we need to have industry experience prior to thinking to build our own startup?
Yeah, one of my slides that I forgot to point that out was I put the label Genentech under there, and so at the chalkboard was Herb Boyer and Ron Swanstrom, and I meant to make this point that to do a business, you need somebody with some business savvy. And Viti was sort of asking that too. Do I need to go into business, or can I just be a scientist? I think it'd be great if you can be everything. Somebody like Anyway, I think there are people who have that, but I would say if you want to do a startup, and you're the scientist, find the business guy to work with, because I don't think you're going to have that skill. But early stage of any startup is 90% science, but if you don't have the money to get it started, it's going to die. And that was the other thing I've learned about being in biotech, that a lot of good companies die because they couldn't raise the money, and the money stream is so tied to the economy. Like right now, it probably is a hard time to raise money, and if you can't keep your company going, then it doesn't matter how great your science is. You need to have money to move it on. So I don't think you necessarily need to be the business and the science guy, but if you want to start something, you probably want to have at least a partner, the two of you together, at least cover those aspects.
Okay, let's take maybe one more question and then we can end. Do we have another one, Salam? I've just finished my PhD and I want to do a career in industry. Should I do a postdoc?
I would say you don't have to do a postdoc, but generally my advice is that I think PhD is excellent training, but I think having at least a couple of years of postdoc after you finish your PhD is really more than just, a cherry on top. I find that people who've just finished their PhD, especially at the end, they finish classes, they finish writing that dissertation. If they can go and do a postdoc where you don't have to teach, you're not going to write a dissertation, you really can focus on your science, and you typically have jumped to maybe a totally new field or a slightly different field. So you then get to, utilize these skills that you brought up, you honed over the time to, really say, okay, let me jump into this field. What do I need to do? And so I think you get so much value out of a couple of year postdoc. I tell you, I did my postdoc at UC San Francisco, and it was the best time of my life. I mean, I really, really enjoyed my postdoc. I ended up spending 5 years there. I don't think you necessarily have to spend 5 years, but in my scientific career, if I could go back and relive a period of time, I would say it's postdoc. So if you have a PhD, go do a postdoc. And, and generally there's opportunity. The people, labs need postdocs, This is also a good chance, like if you're, in Qatar, go do a postdoc overseas, I remember in Singapore, I used to advise, the Singaporeans to do their PhD in Singapore because it's hard to get up to speed doing that. You don't have to also be trying to figure out how to live, and all that. But once you already have your PhD, go and do a postdoc overseas. Get exposed to new cultures, new dynamics. Especially if you haven't been to the U.S. or Europe. So do a postdoc. I think it's great, and postdocs are in such demand. I would highly recommend it. You're going to live till you're 90 years old. You're not in a hurry. When you finish your PhD, you're 24, 25. So go do a postdoc for a couple of years. And that's my advice.
I absolutely agree. I think having that international experience is something that comes with science, and it builds you more than just your scientific skills. And I absolutely agree with that. So in the interest of time, let's finish today's webinar. And I really thank you, Dr. Lawrence, for accepting our invitation and really sharing your expertise and the wonderful discussion we had today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
So thank you all to the audience as well for joining in today and for your active participation. It would be great if you could fill in our short feedback survey that will pop up once the webinar ends. Also, if there are more topics of interest that you'd like us to discuss in future webinars, please do send us an email. Lastly, I'd like to thank the wonderful technical team running the show behind the scenes, Dr. Salam, a fellow postdoc, Mr. Omar, and Ms. Reem from the QBRI Communications Office. So stay tuned in for more inspiring stories in the next webinar. Have a great afternoon, stay safe, stay well, and stay inspired. Thank you.